Welcome back to the shop. This is a 1940s horizontal cutting saw made by Kalamazoo in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Now, my grandfather actually got this from a building that he was a part of demolition for, probably back in the 80s, and ever since then it's been sitting outside collecting rust and dust and a lot of spiders. So in this video I'm pretty much just going to be trying to revive it. I'm not necessarily going to restore it as far as I can tell right now until I can get enough money for a good rattle can paint job, which I'm going to try and go back with the factory colors. I've actually found the catalog for this, and back in 1939 they originally started producing these cutting machines from Kalamazoo, which was a company founded in, I believe, 1887, and had a lot of different types of machining equipment. However, this was their flagship model, the P48, which, if you can't tell, it's small, but man alive does it pack a punch. It's got a 9-to-1 reduction worm gear case on this end, driving the main gauge wheel, and pushing along a 10-foot 5-inch or 121-inch long bandsaw blade, being able to cut metal as far as this berth can handle. Now, it has these two rollers on each side. All of the bearings are seized up on it. However, we take a look underneath the hood here, you can see there's a little bit of slop, but overall, the main drive gear rotates, and the worm gearbox has no play to it whatsoever. And most importantly, the bearing on this side is in perfect working order, and other than rat's nests, has nothing wrong with it whatsoever. So really in this video, I'm mostly going to be trying to work on the 3¼ horsepower electric induction motor on the back side of it. Now, the reason I'm trying to work on that is because that thing is seized more than I've ever seen anything else. I've taken a little bit of time to try and perceive what would be the worst outcome. As far as I can tell, the main inlet of these lines right here has a hole right above the rear main bearing for this whole system. And at the front, it's completely open-faced, as most induction motors are, and has let plenty of moisture seep in there, get into the contacts, get into the windings, and get into the bearings. Now, in worst case scenario, I will swap that out for a 56 frame single horsepower motor from Baylor that I've actually got sitting over there that my grandfather had sitting on a shelf for, I believe, the same exact reason, and hopefully try and get it at least up and moving so I can start using it. I'm definitely not going to leave the paint this way. It is a travesty. Originally, there was a lot of different colors that these things came in, but the one that I liked the most was kind of a seafoamy green that I've seen on other auction websites, and probably is the most genuinely interesting color because it was very similar to what the C10s or the 3100 trucks of the era were actually being painted with from factory. And to me, super cool color. Can't go wrong with seafoam green. Can't go wrong with really anything that's of a vintage mint. Including vintage mint, which is a pretty awesome looking color. But regardless, I'm going to be trying to get this thing back into working order and put it over there next to my lathe as a way to really get myself back into the running as far as having an actually functioning shop. I've got plenty of projects for it. I'm actually trying to work on building a shelf for all my metal pieces, and I've just recently cut 2 10-foot sections of iron to put on that dump bed once that C70 comes in. And genuinely, I can't think of a more useful piece of equipment than a cutting saw like this. Now, getting into all the features is a pretty crazy trip because for 1939 to I think about 1947, if I'm not mistaken, feel free to correct me on that, but for sure from 1939 on, this was a super advanced piece of machinery. I mean, from the gearbox being a worm gear drive, which is pretty amazing and super compact, to it actually having a hydraulic ram used to pick up and lower the main assembly, which it's currently not hooked up. But I think you can barely see that right in here is that hydraulic ram that can be tuned and sorted to where as it's lowering down, it's going at a certain feed rate, so that way you're not overloading anything on the system. As well as movable track carriers, which don't really want to move, but when they do, you can see that you can actually get a much more stable cut by allowing your band to go in between 2 points that are anchored down to this main I-frame, and really make sure there's less chatter, so it's a very clean and constant cut. As well as that, you've got tuning with the handles on the end and a main vise, which can actually move in and out to the full length of this I-beam construction and tilt 45 degrees while you loosen this bolt on the end. So, I mean, unheard of, and genuinely I think it competes with stuff nowadays, which is why I've seen a few lathes of similar construction by Kalamazoo bring around $2,000 when fully restored or in great condition. Now, obviously this thing is neither of those, but I see a lot of potential for this. And as you can see, I've got a bit of a longboard with some old wheels that I found. I think most likely they were off of some type of trolley. But I'm going to be making some cantilever designed caster wheels for this lighter side, and on the heavier side I'm going to use some of those trolley wheels and make it to where I could push down on one lever, pop both of those wheels up, move it around the shop, and then remove both of those and have it sit back on the ground, which most likely is a future project, but regardless, that's the extent of what I want to do to this thing. I want to make it as versatile and useful as possible, because my grandfather had it, and you can't get a machine that's more simplistic, easy use, and really advanced nowadays for anything close to what he probably got this, because doing a demolition on a building, this is scrap iron. So him picking this up and taking it home and having it sit out back for the past 40 years while he was doing other things, but it was left for a purpose. And hopefully I can fulfill that purpose and put this back in the running and have it be a beautiful gemstone of something that I can share with you guys. So please come along with me for this lovely journey, and hopefully you'll get to see this thing cut some. So as you can see right here, this is the main drive motor, and I bent this shroud. That's 100% my fault. It slipped a little bit while I was trying to drag it out from the place that it was hiding in, and sadly I'm going to probably have to either make a new one or find some way to bend this back. But yeah, that was not like that. It was much better. That's my fault. But as you can see, like I showed before, the worm gear drive gearbox functions perfectly. No slop on it whatsoever. Doesn't feel poor or in bad shape, and has plenty of lubrication. Now most of that's probably seeped out because I can see the seals are still a little bit leaky. And if you can see right there, there's just a little bit of grease buildup. But over here on the induction motor, I've already previously removed this, trying to get a wrench of some type to fit onto the main drive shaft, but it is seized. It is locked up to the point that you can actually see there's corrosion buildup around this whole perimeter around this back bearing. So I think first things first, I'm going to loosen this up, take all of these square nuts off the end of this, and just for a second admire the beauty of the quality of this, because this is actually cantilevered. So this whole assembly is made to be tensioned with the weight of the motor. So as that motor weighs down, it actually can tension the belt once all this is lubricated, and this is your only main input as far as tension to keep it from falling all the way off. So really a genius and simplistic way to use what you have at hand instead of fighting against something else, like having a system that opposes gravity. Instead, you're having something that's a constant that is working for you. So just another marvel that I don't think we really aspire to have anymore. So since this bolt was not going to come out, and I'm not very interested in torching the whole thing as I don't want to damage this back plate, and I honestly don't want to damage the motor either if I can salvage it, I've decided I'm just going to take the pin out, and hopefully that'll do all I need it to. So let's play the waiting game, see how long it takes for me to wiggle this thing the rest of the way out of there, and then clean it up and put it back in, hopefully once I've got an actually decent motor. And happy Hanukkah. landed pretty safely. All I gotta do now is clip some wires, and sure enough, we'll be back in the races. So in order to get power more easily to the motor, which is going to be mounted right above this breaker box, I have actually found one that my grandfather had that was in much better shape than this one. I don't know if you can really see it, but the amount of corrosion that's inside of these two bulbs, this thing still uses old plug fuses, which pretty amazing. It literally is just the same kind of fitting as a light bulb, but it has glass and then a tiny little electrode crosser right over there, and that's really what they used most often. But since this thing's so corroded, I'm just gonna rip it off. And all that's hanging that on now is just the ground cable. And I'm gonna fully rewire this because I'd prefer going through it with all the wires that were hung together with duct tape. So at least want to make it up to some sort of standard code. So as you can see here, a mountain of corrosion is formed within the primary and secondary windings. I know I've taken a little bit of a chip out of the inside of this stator, but as far as I can tell, the bearings seem to be fine. There's one that's greased, that's spinning freely, and on the opposite side, inside of this casing, there's a bearing right here, and can't really see that, but it is spinning. Pretty sticky, but that's to be expected. I believe I could oil both of these and maybe shoot a little bit of grease inside of that one to pack it. But the main thing that's making me somewhat apprehensive is the amount of buildup and corrosion and pitting. However, I'm going to try and see if I can't polish these surfaces up, clean everything out, maybe blow it out a little bit with some compressed air, and see if I could slap it back together and put a little bit of amperage to it and make it run. Because at the end of the day, I don't need it to be a very efficient or well-running motor. I need it to just be applicable to really this machine. I've got my backup motor sitting right over here. My only issue with that is, well, there's a couple issues, but if you look right here, that is the shaft for it. Don't really feel like I can flip it around, but that shaft is about that far too small. And really, if you're trying to mess around with all these forces, having a shaft that is that much smaller is not that great of an idea. As well as all of these wires were taken off. This is actually something I robbed off of another electric motor that I had sitting around trying to get this wired back together, but until I can get into a catalog and actually figure out where to put what, I'm not very keen on plugging this thing in with a positive hook to ground or vice versa, blowing it up, or having it wired up correctly to 220 and putting it on 110 and have it, you know, cause some issues. So I'm just gonna leave this thing for right now. If I need to, I can definitely take it and put it onto here. I don't think I'll have any issues with it. For now, in this heap of rust and dust and spiders, I'm gonna try and salvage a working motor out of this. So here we've got old and new, quote unquote. So you can see, those are the contacts inside of there that are getting closed as you move this lever up and down. Much cleaner, much nicer. You can actually see the copper is still completely new inside of these two joints, and came with unbusted fuses, which I'm probably going to reuse. And the old one we've got right here, only one half is actually mobile, and this thing looks like it's been through a war. I'm going to see if I can salvage the faceplate off of it, just because it does have the readout, and maybe scraping some of this grime off of it will lead it to look a little bit better, so I can put it on here, because really, if I'm not mistaken, it's the exact same style, or at least direction, for this on-off marker, so that way this would at least have some original pieces left on it. I just buttoned up this capacitor cover for the motor starter, and just wanted to show off a little bit of the internals here. I've got this actually sitting. Somehow the mount for this got broken off, but this right here is the wire that feeds the capacitor, and here is the wire that supplies that auxiliary winding. And as you can see right in here, that moves back and forward. So on the actual rotating assembly, right here we have something that pretty well acts as a button. So this thing commonly is fully pressed open, which closes that contact. And as it speeds up past a certain point, it closes and those auxiliary windings stop receiving power. So that makes the system more efficient and allows a startup, because these auxiliary windings are specifically designed to overcome the normal forces of the main windings. Hence why they're only covering about half of the total radius of these windings on the interior. But I'm gonna button this thing up, put some tape through all these holes, and see if I can't do some good by grinding off all this old paint and painting it a different color, and maybe doing a little bit extra, because at this point I'm pretty connected to this thing, and I'm very impressed with how well it was manufactured. I think this thing's from the 40s or 50s. It's a 3/4 horsepower, probably more like 5/8 of a horsepower motor, but I robbed this off of a full horsepower motor, which should be fine. It's 400 to 480 microfarads. And then all I need to do now is really just clean up some surfaces and then apply a fresh coat of paint. I'm just taking a video because I'm pretty proud of this masking job so far. Especially, all this is just paper towels tucked into the corners. So I'd recommend it, honestly, if anybody's doing something similar to me and painting a motor. This was robbed off of something else, so really this is the only way to get everything covered pretty consistently. I think that's like 4 or 5 paper towels just tucked into there, and they're completely reusable afterwards, so not really much lost. So as we can see here, I've actually got this disassembled once again after the paint job. And as I was disassembling it for the final reassemble, I was just going through everything and cleaning everything up. This contactor connected by this wire right here, this back plate fell and ripped this in half, so I've just recently re-glued that. Well, I think in the last 30 minutes, and soldered on 2 new wires so that way I can have a little bit extra distance. And hopefully now I can reassemble this and this will allow this motor starter capacitor to actually function. Well, currently I'm wiring up the main panel. As you can see, I've got it painted and got all the contacts clean. So now everything slides in and out, and I've got an actual breaker. These are the actual end bits that I'm going to put on the positive and neutral, white being neutral, black being positive. And I'm going to tag in ground one of these two mounting bolts up here. That way, if the motor, because it's old enough to where it doesn't have its own internally common ground, if that thing starts shorting or anything goes wrong there, it can at least ground to the frame. So here we have everything pretty well disassembled. As you can see right here, I've got my breaker. Both the positive and neutral are hooked in there by friction. I haven't found the right fittings for them yet, and I'm going to replace that whole cable just because it's so wore out. I've got this one sitting right here. It's got a ground built into it, so I'm going to see if I can't ground out a couple of the pieces of the circuit towards the main breaker line. Here we've got the motor in all its golden glory, and power being thrown through the bandsaw through this main switch. So as you can see, I've got that hooked up. Then I've got my cable snagged right into that, coming along here along the new splice end, so that way I can move it back and forward. And that motor now has a motor starter on it. So if you'd kindly listen here, without any touching, it now runs. And that all functions based on that switch. I have succeeded on this day. It's about 0 dark 30 right now, so I need to go home. But she is going to live, and definitely is going to look good while doing it. Now, I've actually got another part to this, which is going over the whole bandsaw in its entirety, and I'm just waiting on a couple of little pieces to come in. I'm waiting on paint, which I'm going to get a good scheme going for this thing. I've looked over the current day Kalamazoos, and this one seems to follow the same style. So right here, you've got orange on the interior, and these wheels, if you take off this nut, which I've got it hand tight since I'm going to need to polish all this pretty quickly, you can see that these were orange as well. That's not rust, that is orange paint. There we go. But last thing to do would be get this hydraulic working right here so it can raise and lower under its own power. Get the vise, or I guess the jaws, freed up. Polish everything down and make sure all these controls are all functional, as well as restringing all this stuff inside of here. I gotta say thank you for watching. This has definitely been one of the most beneficial projects I've done. I've fully rebuilt this, and I can say that because I don't think there's a part in it that I haven't touched at this point. And it works like a charm, and hopefully I can bring this thing back to life like my grandfather wanted.